Welcome back to Second Chance, a series where I take an extended look back at games that didn't originally click with me during my first hour with them. This month, I'm revisiting A Plague Tale: Innocence. When I first played the opening hour of the game, I was captivated by the visuals, compelled by the performances, and thought the story threads that were set up were quite interesting. Large swarms of rats definitely made a strong impression too, and I appreciated the way that they shied away from light and how it could create the possibility for some really creative puzzles. I ultimately passed on continuing with it though, due to the inclusion of some of my most disliked mechanics, those being white ledges and some contrived stealth scenarios. So now, a year and a half later, after I've lived through a Plague Tale of my own, have the positives grown to outweigh the negatives? Or were there even larger issues present that weren't yet visible? A Plague Tale: Innocence is not a happy game. It doesn't fill you with joy or hope, and it certainly doesn't make itself into an inviting place in which to spend a cozy afternoon. It sets out to create an unsettling mood from beginning to end, and it executes on that with a near singular vision. There are moments of brightness, yes, but they only exist in order to give the contrast that's necessary in order for the story to go as dark as it wants to go. The story of the game is arguably fairly simple, or at least it starts that way. A brother and sister have their parents murdered in front of them, and they must flee for safety. Through a series of encounters and events, it climaxes into something much stranger and grander than I anticipated when I first started playing. I won't spoil what I mean by that, but the direction the story went definitely took me by surprise. Disappointingly, despite having some interesting characters, the journey never fully carried the emotional weight that I was hoping that a tale of struggling family would bring, and that, in my opinion, is due to a failing of the plot. The fact that the two siblings have a shared disdain for one another makes for some great groundwork to build emotion from. Amicia is the older sister who never got to be close with her mom, a fact that she blames squarely on her younger brother, Hugo. And Hugo has grown up not knowing his sister, which causes him to have a hard time coming to grips with being forced to travel with her, rather than stay with their mother. Why they feel the way they do and how they react to situations, in addition to each other, are solid building blocks for generating empathy, yet they go underdeveloped. Moments of frustration and flare-ups are key plot points, for sure. But moments of reconciliation and understanding are mostly relegated to moments that accompany optional collectibles. By the very nature of these being optional, they're unable to compensate for the negativity that is otherwise generated. The good deeds that are done never get taken far enough, and by the time I rolled credits, I had no more of a connection to the characters than I did at the start. I was never emotionally invested in them, despite all of the significant tribulations they jointly endured. While the overall storytelling may not have landed for me, the setting and the environment that the story takes place in did. Frankly, it's incredible, and for being Asobo Studios' first original game in a decade, it's that much more impressive. The visuals were a treat, let down only by the occasional subpar animation. The environmental storytelling details that exist in the background of these levels also add a lot to the feeling that this is a real, lived-in world, even if they're not that hugely abundant. These aren't so much complaints though, as it clearly shows the team knew how to prioritize their polish, and which things didn't need as much time spent on them. Now, the parts of the game that didn't work for me during my first impressions, those being contrived stealth sequences and white ledges, did improve, but to varying degrees. I keep using the phrase white ledges, and what I mean by that is really a combination of both the literal visual language used to highlight the critical path, as well as the mechanics used to engage with them. There is no jump button in A Plague Tale: Innocence, only an interact button. To advance to a different elevation, a white ledge must be interacted with in order to climb up. These scenarios exist in many games for several reasons, but in this case, the most common purpose is to disguise load times. That's an admirable goal, but the problem that I have is that these encounters drag the action to a halt and ask nothing of the player. They provide no challenge and just involve pushing a button and then waiting. At that point, are they really any different than just using a loading screen? This is 100% just a personal pet peeve, I get that, and I understand that it stems from a limitation of the technology that was available at the time that the game was made, but I can't wait for this trend to be over. Thankfully, the creators also recognized that these sections are lackluster, so they've attempted to at least include occasional puzzles as well. The downside is that these require very little additional effort, and often feature the same push a button and wait gameplay. Graciously, the white ledges are used sparingly, and that's their most redeeming quality. Stealth sequences do little to go beyond the basic avoid the guards gameplay that is played in game after game. Hiding in tall grass, throwing objects to cause a distraction, and guards that follow a rigid and unrealistic patrolling pattern are all tropes that are on full display here. I'm rarely a fan of games that have these elements, for more reasons than I'd care to get into here. But in this case, the fact that they're occasionally supplemented with gameplay involving hordes of rats, it makes them a bit more tolerable in my book. That has to do with the fact that in any area that involves the swarm of rats, the tools available to deal with them can be really engaging. Light can be used to push them out of an area, and alternatively, bait can be used to lure them to a specific area. Using a guard as that bait is perhaps some of the most fun to be had in the game. These tools and more layer on top of each other, in addition to the patrolling guards, to make for some really interesting scenarios, much more so than just the guards alone do. Every encounter is best viewed as if it were a puzzle, but by and large, I was disappointed with how simple they were to solve, especially considering that all the resources required for the ideal solution are provided just before every encounter. However, the more that I played and the more complex that the encounters got, the more that I grew to enjoy them. Enough mechanics are eventually introduced that it was really able to deliver that power fantasy that only video games can provide, and things that started off threatening no longer felt as oppressive as they once were. Now, this game was never going to rise to the top of my all-time favorites list. It contains a few too many personal annoyances for that to ever happen. But when I started my Second Chance series, I made a commitment that every game I go back to I'll play for 6 hours. I didn't finish A Plague Tale in half a dozen hours, but I need to stress that I was enjoying myself enough that I did see it through all the way to the end. As somebody who has demonstrated that I have absolutely no problem cutting ties with a game that I'm not enjoying, that should count for something. All in all, it's impossible to deny that the framework of the game, the actual bones that it's been built out of, is very strong. The story of a brother and sister forced to find a way to care about one another after years of disdain is thematically very powerful, despite there being some missteps that keep it from fully landing emotionally. The gameplay of a plague-ridden society, where rats have taken over everything, is both spooky and intriguing, even if the culmination of the ideas don't get much time to shine. But seeing all the glimmers of greatness in every department gives me hope that with a bit more time and a bit bigger budget, a sequel might be able to clean up many of the rough edges here. Thanks once more to my patrons, and thank you for watching.